Crazy conspiracy theories that turned out to be true. Operation Cauldron. The year is 1952, and the British government has just started a secret trial of biological weapons. This secret operation involved scientists from both the Royal Navy and Porton Down, and their job was to release biological agents onto caged monkeys and guinea pigs to see exactly what would happen. And the specific biological agents that these scientists were releasing onto these animals were the following: the pneumonic plague, the bubonic plague, brucellosis, and tularemia. The ultimate goal of these secret operations were to see what the actual effects be on these animals to test their effectiveness in a warfare situation. But of course, it doesn't end there. This is only the beginning. And Britain isn't even the only government involved. Even though this entire operation is undertaken by Britain, these secret tests were actually a joint venture between the United States and Canada as well. And due to this collaboration, US documents actually later confirmed that this operation was not purely defensive in nature, like they tried to initially claim once they were exposed. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Now, when doing testing with extremely infectious diseases, especially when you're doing it in secret, you have to make sure that you're doing this in a way that is extremely covert and safe to ensure that nobody sees it and the spread of this disease does not go outside your test subjects. And for that reason, the British government decided that the best way to execute Operation Cauldron was by literally taking a floating pontoon, putting it off the coast of the Isle of Lewis, filling it with 83 monkeys and 3,492 guinea pigs, dragging them into the middle of the water, and then, once this worst recreation of Noah's Ark ever was in the perfect position, the biological agents that I mentioned earlier were then dispensed onto all of these animals. The first way they infected these animals was by suspending a bomb, which then infected everybody, and the second method was by literally just spraying them as well. And I mean, if they already were able to spray them, then why do they need the bomb? Regardless, once the biological agents were dispersed over all of the test subjects, the animals aboard were then taken onto a boat and then dissected to see their cause of death. I just want to quickly point out how crazy it is that the British government is literally testing out a bubonic plague biological weapon in an open air environment, like they didn't learn anything from the 1300s. Now here's the thing. After this initial test, Operation Cauldron was initially considered to be successful. The British government felt proud that they had just discovered a brand new biological weapon, and they also had a brand new way of testing biological weapons. But this is where things take a massive turn for the worst. The conspiracy theory here isn't the fact that the British government killed an oddly specific amount of guinea pigs. What is what happened during the final series of tests of Operation Cauldron. During one of the very last tests of Operation Cauldron, a commercial fishing vessel accidentally drove directly through a cloud of plague bacteria on its way out of Britain to a fishing trip in the waters outside of Iceland. Now, to the British government's benefit, they did warn this fishing boat multiple times that there was an active military test going on, but the fishing boat ignored it and went right into the danger zone. Now, this is obviously a major concern. A commercial fishing vessel with 18 people on it has now just unknowingly traveled through a huge cloud of bubonic plague and other disease-filled gas. And the British government was extremely aware of this. So what did they do? Did they stop this fishing vessel for disinfection and medical examination to make sure that the fishermen were safe and that there was no spread of disease outside of these fishermen? Obviously not. The British government didn't tell this fishing vessel at all. Instead, what they decided to do was spy on this fishing vessel, turning these 18 crewmates into their brand new guinea pigs. For 21 days following the initial exposure, a British destroyer battleship was secretly observing the fishing vessel and also monitoring all of their radio communications, listening for any sort of medical distress calls. That alone is diabolical. But it gets worse, because during this time when this fishing vessel was being monitored, this fishing vessel was actually scheduled to stop at a port in England for a few days. And during this time, all of the crewmates would be getting off the boat and mingling with the general public. Now, obviously, this would be a huge health concern. So at this point, the British government finally intervened and told them what was going on, right? No. The British government allowed all of these 18 fishermen to mingle with the general public, further expanding their unconsensual human test subject pool. However, fortunately, nobody got sick. And because nobody got sick, and nobody outside a select handful of people involved in Operation Cauldron were aware of this, everybody involved swept Operation Cauldron under the rug, and for decades to come, Operation Cauldron was essentially not real. The government was successfully able to cover it up at the time, and most of the documents relevant to this case were actually burnt. And that is where the story would have ended. That was until rumors started floating around that eventually became a conspiracy theory. And by the time that these rumors and conspiracies were really starting to gain some traction, there was finally some investigation that was taking place. One of the first acknowledgments of this conspiracy was in 1979, literally 27 years after the experiment, when one of the MPs of the Western Isles, the area where this experiment took place, acknowledged this conspiracy and even questioned the defense secretary about them in Parliament. However, the defense secretary literally just said, quote, "They did not impinge in any way on the general public, and the case at that point was essentially closed. That was until 6 years later in 1985, when a whistleblower named Clive Ponting came across one of the files surrounding Operation Cauldron that had not been destroyed. And with Clive wanting the public to be aware about this crazy experiment, Clive anonymously told the Observer newspaper about it, which led to the Observer writing an article headlined, "British Germ Bomb Sprays Trawler." But even with this crazy story being exposed and making headlines, it was still not confirmed or acknowledged by the British government. 9 years later, in 1994, it was once again brought to Parliament, but shut down for being unsubstantiated. But then, finally, on January 21st, 2008, the Information Commissioner's Office ruled against the Ministry of Defense, forcing them to release everything they had about Operation Cauldron. And the biggest smoking gun that still existed was a 47-minute-long video that showed the exact pontoon that was used and footage of exactly what happened on that pontoon. This 47-minute-long video literally exposed everything, and at that point, it was confirmed 56 years later that this crazy conspiracy theory was actually the truth. The business plot. The year is 1933. Franklin D. Roosevelt, or FDR, has just been elected as the 32nd President of the United States. However, some people are not happy about this election, specifically some of the most wealthy and powerful businessmen in America. Why were these wealthy businessmen upset about FDR becoming president? Well, that's because FDR had a major plan to implement social programs within the United States, along with other progressive policies, and most notably, a shift away from the gold standard. Now, with all of his new political changes about to be implemented under FDR, what do you think that these powerful businessmen did in retaliation? Do you think they maybe donated more money to the other party next time the election rolled around? Or do you think that they tried to organize a coup to overthrow FDR to have a fascist regime installed within the United States of America? Well, if you're watching this video, you know it's the last one. But let me explain. Smedley Butler is a retired military corps major general. And in 1933, he was retired and highly decorated, and also a very outspoken anti-war activist. Smedley Butler was generally respected, but was specifically adored by the veteran population within the United States, a population that was relatively large after World War I. And because all of the most wealthy and powerful businessmen were upset that FDR was about to fundamentally shift the country, at least in the eyes of these men, they decided that their best course of action was to orchestrate a coup and to have Smedley Butler be at the forefront of it. And the reason why they wanted Smedley specifically was because he was respected by veterans. And for that reason, if they could get Smedley on their side to spread their message, then these veterans would feel inspired to follow their ideology, and they could use that manpower to overthrow the government. That was the idea, at least. The first point of contact between these wealthy businessmen and Butler was when Gerald C. McGuire approached Butler and simply probed him about his stance on FDR to kind of get a temperature check on Butler. And Butler, assuming something was going on, kind of played along and acted like he wasn't on the FDR side when he actually was. And it was at that moment when Butler was aware that some of the most powerful businessmen were all on the same page about financing a private army, bringing all of this manpower armed directly to the White House, and then giving FDR a list of commands to submit to, and the business plot, aka the fascist regime, would be then installed. The crazy thing is, all they asked of Butler was to give a speech. This coup already had a plan on exactly how they would organize, finance, and manage this small army and overthrowing of the government. The only thing that they wanted Butler for was to give a pre-written speech at the American Legion Convention, with the hopes that the speech would resonate with these military veterans, causing them to join this coup, allowing these businessmen to follow through with their plan. And as a reward, these people would make Butler the fascist dictator of this new American regime. Now, fortunately, this was something that Butler had absolutely no interest in. And although he declined requests to give speeches on numerous occasions and also made it clear that he was anti-war and also anti-banker, these individuals were so stubborn and so certain that Butler was the man to help their dreams come true that they were very persistent. So persistent, in fact, that in 1934, only 1 year later, Butler testified under oath before the United States House of Representatives Special Committee on Un-American Activities, specifically about the revelations he had about this entire plot. But this is where things get a bit murky, because the initial conspiracy theory of was there American businessmen having secret conversations and planning a coup to overthrow FDR to reinstate the gold standard a real thing? Yes. And unless you believe that Butler was lying under oath, then that plot was absolutely confirmed to be true during Butler's testimony. But where things get murky and, I guess, unconfirmed was the exact length that this plan was actually going to go through. Because when this entire situation was initially exposed, a lot of powerful people, specifically the governor of New York and other politicians, tried to laugh it off as, oh, well, Butler is over-exaggerating this. This wasn't actually going to happen. These were just rich guys that were upset and they were just chatting ideas, but this wasn't real. And this sentiment by some is also confirmed by the ultimate decision decision of the Congressional Committee. One, because nobody was ever prosecuted when this was brought to light, and also the Congressional Committee final report said, quote, "There is no question that these attempts were discussed, were planned, and might have even been placed in execution when and if the financial backers deemed it expedient." But that's the issue. Might have been placed into execution. That plausible deniability gave these extremely powerful men an out to not be prosecuted, to not be further questioned, and also to allow them to have the story of, oh, no, that wasn't real, that was just an idea, when the plan ultimately failed and was exposed to the general public. Big Tobacco lied to you. In today's day and age, we know that smoking cigarettes has numerous side effects. We know that tobacco is bad for you. We know that inhaling carcinogens is not good for your lungs. And we know that nicotine is extremely addictive. Unfortunately, this is all now common knowledge and adults can make their decision on what they want to do. But prior to the 1990s, major tobacco companies had the general public in a chokehold, nearly convincing the world that smoking cigarettes was not only a good thing to do, but potentially even healthy for some situations. Now, the real paradigm shift around cigarettes happened in the 1990s, when whistleblowers were exposing the tobacco companies for all of the nefarious activities they were doing. However, that wasn't the first or only time that science proving cigarettes were bad for you actually came out. In the early 1950s, there were multiple scientific studies proving a link between cigarettes and cancer. And it was with the publishing of these studies that the American tobacco industry ramped up their marketing to the absolute next level to ensure their chokehold on the American public and to ultimately assert their dominance and maintain their fortune. But even before these studies came out, the marketing was still heavy. Like, for example, take the 1920s. During the 1920s, it was frowned upon for women to smoke. So for that reason, these tobacco companies took it upon themselves to shift the American mindset on women smoking so that these tobacco companies had 50% more consumers. And how they did this was crazy. Essentially, what these tobacco companies did was not only pay influential women to smoke in public settings and to be photographed and filmed smoking in public settings, but they even hijacked the women's rights movement from the 1920s to make their cigarettes seem like a way of fighting the patriarchy. And with the rise of feminism and empowering women, tobacco companies realized that if they could get their cigarettes involved in the movement, they would make a lot of money. And what they ultimately ended up doing was positioning cigarettes as a way to fight against the patriarchy, and they even eventually, in some ad campaigns, called cigarettes freedom sticks, empowering women to fight social norms by smoking cigarettes and being just like the men. That's the crazy level of manipulation we're talking about. But that's truly only the beginning. But I wanted to highlight that example because it's just insane. Another example of tobacco companies hijacking a movement was during World War II. In the early 1940s, smoking in public was actually banned in Nazi Germany because it was known that smoking was not good for you. So, the tobacco companies in America made smoking seem like they were anti-Nazi activities and patriotic in nature. Once again, hijacking a movement and profit that they knew would ultimately lead to deaths. But on top of hijacking women's rights movements or wartime movements, the tobacco industry was not a stranger to creative advertising. And the tobacco company Camel had some extremely notable advertisements specifically featuring doctors and dentists that literally said something along the lines of, "Most doctors smoke Camels," which is literally an endorsement from doctors to smoke cigarettes. And these ads ran for decades. And with that association of doctors and surgeons with cigarettes, obviously they have to be healthy, right? Oh, and let's not even forget the literal Flintstones cigarette ads, obviously aimed at targeting children to get interested in cigarettes as well. At this point, I know I'm not saying necessarily anything new, but I really want to emphasize this point that during this time, prior to all of the anti-tobacco messaging that most of us grew up with, or at least experienced and saw the shift in our lifetime, the perception of cigarettes was completely different in past times. And I'm really trying to emphasize that point, that how strong the marketing and propaganda was in the name of tobacco. Which leads us to the conspiracy theory at play. It was claimed that all throughout the early 1900s, from basically 1900 to the 1990s, Big Tobacco had no idea that there was any negative side effects of tobacco. They were claiming that through all of the research that they did, there was health benefits and negligible side effects to tobacco, and for that reason, they were doing nothing wrong in their marketing or advertising, and their product was completely fine. Now, obviously today, we know that's not true at all. Although, at the time, the conversation was still ongoing, and it was up for people to decide whether they wanted to believe reports that were not typically marketed, or the marketing that was shoved down their throats on a daily basis. In 1964, when another major report came out, once again directly linking lung cancer and cigarettes, did these tobacco industries do anything to change their blend? Did they potentially stop selling their products? Did they recognize what they were doing was hurting people? Of course not. What they decided to do was double down. And not only buy their own studies and buy their own doctors, but they decided to go on marketing campaigns that specifically planted seeds of doubt in the consumer's mind to essentially try to nullify any genuine articles coming out against cigarettes. And I'll tell you what, these tobacco companies had much more of a marketing budget than any independent researcher could ever dream of. And it was for that reason that Big Tobacco was able to have this reign for so long. So even though real articles were coming out proving that cigarettes were detrimental to your health, for every one study that was coming out, the tobacco industry was paying for hundreds, flooding the market with conflicting information, allowing people to never come to a real conclusion. And on top of that, the tobacco industry was also actively trying to discredit any doctor who was personally speaking out against tobacco to once again lower their credibility. In the eyes of the general public, if you listened to Big Tobacco's propaganda and took it at face value, it would seem like they're doing everything right. As studies were coming out, they made sure to do their own independent studies to try to confirm or dispute those claims. And they were also actively trying to make as many improvements as possible to cigarettes, specifically adding filters and whatnot. And on top of this, Big Tobacco even created its own health committee to investigate tobacco even further, to ensure that the product that they were selling was 100% healthy. But these smoke and mirrors, no pun intended, could not go on for long. In 1996, Jeff Wiggins became one of the most famous whistleblowers in American history, when he provably exposed the tobacco industry for not only manipulating nicotine levels in tobacco to increase its addictiveness, as well as adding other chemicals such as ammonia, but also for intentionally falsifying reports and also hiding reports that proved cigarettes were dangerous for many decades. I'll be honest, at first I was kind of hesitant to add this into this video because I know that people are so aware now of how bad cigarettes are and how manipulative the cigarette industry can be. But I wanted to reiterate some key examples and also make the point extremely clear that there was once a time when people believed the propaganda from cigarette companies. And there was multiple decades where the cigarette companies had the American public and the world in a chokehold, specifically because of their targeted propaganda. And it has taken many decades, banning of advertisements, multiple whistleblowers, numerous studies proving the link between tobacco and cancer, just to try to make a dent in the massive narrative that the tobacco company built for the last near century. But yeah, it literally changed how Americans perceived marketing and corporations forever. And for that reason, I thought it was worth keeping in this video. But let's move on. The Oak Ridge experiments. At this point, everybody and their grandmother knows about Project MKUltra, and we've even talked about it in this exact series. But did you know that Canada had its own secret MKUltra project and is still currently being investigated by the Canadian government? That's right, it is called the Oak Ridge experiment. Oak Ridge for years was the only forensic hospital in Ontario for people that were deemed criminally insane. And for that reason, Oak Ridge was the place that people were sent to who truly needed a psychiatric recalibration. And it was believed that the new experiments that were going on within the Oak Ridge walls were beneficial. The Oak Ridge experiments start with a doctor named Elliot T. Barker, who was a newly graduated psychiatrist out of the University of Toronto. And ever since graduating school, he was inspired by Dr. Maxwell Jones, who developed the concept of therapeutic community as a treatment for mental illness. And essentially what therapeutic community was having the mentally ill patient take an active part in their own treatment. But not only that, play an active role in the treatment of others as well, basically creating some sort of group healing. Now that on the surface may not seem evil per se, it's interesting, especially for the 1950s, it's at least something to potentially consider, but what stemmed out of this initial inclination turned into something truly evil. After graduating, but before arriving at Oak Ridge, Baker traveled around the world visiting interesting places, notably Chinese prison camps, to see how they controlled people with behaviors. When Barker finally arrived in Oak Ridge in 1965, he had his perfect plan in mind. And his great idea was to combine truth serums, sensory deprivation, and patient-led encounter groups to force psychopaths to confront their mental illness. Already off to a rough start, and I'm sure you can kind of already see the MKUltra comparisons. But trust me, we're only getting started. One of the first major issues with Oak Ridge was the fact that they were completely understaffed, which was one of the big incentives for hiring patients as therapists. They were basically having the prisoner patients that were already at Oak Ridge to now act as the caretaker or therapist for other patients. Essentially the blind leading the blind. But it wasn't just talk therapy that these prisoner patients were having with each other. At Oak Ridge, you could order a drug treatment for another patient just because you wanted to see what would happen. And that includes ordering somebody else LSD, methamphetamine, or even some of their truth serums. And they even offered alcohol therapy. Interestingly, they knew that the alcohol wasn't going to cure mental illness, but what they figured would happen was that the alcohol would lower the mental defenses of these patients, forcing them to examine their own shortcomings, ideally allowing them to become aware of their mental illness, and then at that point becoming cured. That was the mindset, at least at the time. And while it's an interesting hypothesis at best, this was taken as truth and implemented in the worst way possible. The experiments that took place under Barker at Oak Ridge became more and more depraved and more unconsensual. It typically included patients with numerous experimental drug treatments multiple times a day, essentially keeping the inmates drugged out of their mind to the point of psychosis. One of the men that was held at Oak Ridge said the following, quote, "They gave you 6 shots a day of that stuff. By the end of the day, you didn't know who you were or what you were doing. You can't do that to people over and over and call it treatment, because that's just a nice word that people want to hear. The real word is torture, because that's all it was, beginning to end." And the experience that one man had within Oak Ridge was not uncommon. That was essentially the norm. But on top of just injecting drugs into prisoner patients, they also took it a step further. Barker shortly after invented something known as the Total Encounter Capsule. And essentially what it was a windowless room with padded walls, no furniture, and only an open toilet. There was no lights, there was one hole for food, and that was it. Prisoners would be sent in this room, naked, and would be in there alone in the dark for as long as 10 days at a time. Now, similar to MKUltra, the point of these experiments were to try to break the mind of the individual. Although with MKUltra, the goal is mind control. And with the Oak Ridge experiments, the goal, at least allegedly, was to help solve mental illness through what ended up just being torture. What's really interesting was that the Oak Ridge experiments at the time weren't necessarily even a secret. People weren't just extremely privy to it. And for those who were in the know, specifically in the psychiatric community, Elliot Baker seemed like somebody who was doing innovative work, and his experiments were considered avant-garde, interesting. And because at the time so little was known about mental health, this was seen as a great opportunity to learn. And people even believed that these treatments could potentially be beneficial, which obviously was not the case at all. But it still continues to get worse. Another major issue that was happening at Oak Ridge was because it was gaining popularity through the experimental treatments that were happening in it, the government was becoming more and more open to sending lesser criminals there. And it even got to the point where mischievous teenagers that were getting caught up in trouble were given the option to either serve prison time or go to Oak Ridge. And if you don't know what's going on behind Oak Ridge, anything sounds better than prison. And keep in mind, these people weren't murderers. These were like kids that were doing drugs and stealing cars. Not good, but there's a difference. But here's the thing. These teenagers that ended up getting sent to Oak Ridge had the same experience as these other criminals. Coupled with the fact that not only were they tortured all day themselves, but they were also surrounded by extremely mentally ill people that were also tortured. And it goes without saying that the environment was extremely hostile. Specifically because staff was low and security was almost non-existent. Patients had to fend for themselves, and in some cases they were literally taking care of each other. Although I use the term taking care of lightly, because they were responsible for each other, but nothing beneficial was happening. And unfortunately, some extremely depraved things were happening. But in case that isn't bad enough, in 1976, another forensic unit was opened. This time for women. I guess I forgot to mention it, but Oak Ridge was only for men. So they opened another location specifically for women. The location opened with 30 extremely mentally ill women. And unfortunately, these women were subject to the same conditions as Oak Ridge, but there was something worse happening. Because while at Oak Ridge, inmates were taking care of each other, in this new all-female facility, they decided that it would be smart to take some of the men from Oak Ridge to bring them to this new female facility, giving these men the role of therapist. That's right. Some of the most dangerous men in Canada, a lot of which who were in Oak Ridge for sexual-related crimes, who have been tortured for the last few years, are now going to be sent to an all-women's facility with low security to act as some sort of authoritative figure. I'm sure you can only imagine what happened, and unfortunately, it was probably even sadder than you could possibly imagine. So yeah, we all know about MKUltra, but in the 1960s and 70s in Canada, the exact same things were going on. To me, this reminds me a lot of the whole lobotomy thing. It got very popular and was interesting for a while, but